Oh, hello, and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. And when the Four Seasons became the Four Seasons, I'm not sure if they knew just how fortuitous that name would be, because the band has really survived so many musical trends, and they really are a band for all seasons, all four of them, at least by my last count. And the key to their success is multiple fold. One, I think it was because they were both modern and wholesome. They created a sound that was very unique to the time. And yes, it does trace its origins to the sort of doo-wop vocal groups of the 50s, but they're harmonizing the sort of high falsetto that Frankie Valli, the lead singer, very famous, of course, used was something that made them instantly recognizable. And also, what was a huge distinguishing factor was their original songwriting. Within the band, the keyboard player and arranger was also a master songwriter who wrote or co-wrote just about all of their hits, some of the biggest hits of all time, and that was Bob Gaudio. Wonderful musician who, well, we'll get to what he did with a few others later on, but the band just churned out hit after hit after hit. Between Valli's lead vocals and Gaudio's music writing, they were a band that could do no wrong, and the world really fell in love with them, particularly the original lineup, which, Four Seasons, four people. On guitar, there was Tommy DeVito. On bass, there was Nick Mazzy, and then, of course, Valli being the lead singer. Now, they were a band that had consistent hits throughout the 1960s. And I mentioned this, I've just sort of been over the last few days talking about other musicians who sort of had late 50s or early 60s beginnings and survived through all of the many changes to music that came through the 60s. Now, many people argue about what those changes were, but I would say that the biggest was the war in Vietnam and the sort of premonition of eerie or grim things to come that happened in '63 when President Kennedy was shot. This changed music. It created a much more politicized music in both the pop and rock worlds that were becoming increasingly similar by the late 60s. So it was more politically charged, more negative in many cases. There was, the love and flower power side, but there was also the bring it all down man side. And, there's virtues and vices to both of those things. And the other thing that happened around the same time is that amplifiers and PAs got louder. So if you wanted a louder, more raucous, darker sound, you could have these big Marshall amplifiers and these big PAs with Macintosh amplifiers, Altec Lansing, or JBL speakers that would do the trick. Now, in all of this chaos, was there room for a band whose bread and butter was vocal harmonies, falsetto singing, and great traditional songwriting? And the answer that record buying and radio request calling audiences throughout the world had was yes. Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons remained a force to be reckoned with throughout the 1960s. True, the early and mid 60s were something that they really owned more than anything else, but they never really went away. And throughout this period, Gaudio became a very much in-demand songwriter, which is something that would really follow him right up into the present day. He wrote for so many other artists. He would later on in the 70s write for one of my favorite vocalists, Peabo Bryson, Roberta Flack, another one of my favorites. He even did stuff for Barry Manilow, Diana Ross, Eric Carmen, think All by Myself. I don't think you read that one, but that's what he's famous for. And even Michael Jackson. But the thing that I find most interesting is that Bob Gaudio composed the music to Frank Sinatra's experimental album Watertown from, I think it was released in 1970. So just the tail end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. Now, Frank Sinatra, far from being a stranger to the concept album, I, on many occasions, have credited Sinatra with, in fact, inventing the concept album in the 1950s and carrying it forward into the 1960s. As such, Sinatra is someone primarily responsible for transforming the LP from just a collection of singles, B-sides, and filler to a cohesive piece of music tied together by a common musical or psychological theme. And Watertown is no different. I think it's a great album. A lot of people passed it over at the time, but it's really begun to sort of revive itself among the fans who are rediscovering this interesting album between one of the goat of vocals, if you will, and one of the most important songwriters of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Bob Gaudio. Now, the Four Seasons were by no means done in the 70s. They had a huge revival in terms of both performance and in terms of recording, because in 1975 they had what I suppose you could call a comeback album of sorts that really brought them back to the front of the charts. And this was the album Who Loves You. The title track, written by Gaudio, became huge. December 1963 became a hit. People were listening to it at the discotheque, even though it wasn't a disco type of song. Frankie Valli would later sing the theme song to Grease, written by the Bee Gees as opposed to Gaudio. But between the two of them writing and singing, respectively, for various people, they kept things going. And of course, the Four Seasons kept going under various lineups. Gaudio and Valli ceased performing together, but they jointly own the brand, which maybe is a bit unfair to Massey and DeVito, but I'm not saying anything. Gaudio is still with us, and Frankie Valli, until recently, was still very much performing, although getting on in the years. But I think the reason the Four Seasons are important is that their popularity was consistent from the early 60s right up until the late 70s. They were able to adapt to the era of disco. They were able to survive the era of psychedelic and hard rock. They were able to really persevere through it. And again, it's a theme that I mentioned on some other videos this week. If you are a good songwriter and are either part of a group or a solo artist that can perform those songs convincingly, you are going to be around for a very long time. Maybe all four seasons. One of the best, finest groups of all time. So many hits. Maybe the ultimate rock and roll group. Definitely a contender. As always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.